think my biggest impression from covering the Egyptian story this year is the sense of betrayal and anger that people in Egypt still have. When I was there back in January, when the revolution started, talking to protesters there, the general consensus, and really this is what people were saying to me, was that they felt that they were part of history. They were creating a new country and a new future for Egypt. Going back again in November, when the second revolution happened, or the second part of the first revolution, depending who you talk to, those same protesters told me that they felt that the trust that they had placed in the army had been misplaced.
There are hundreds of thousands of people who are still arriving here in Tahrir Square. As you can see, many of them heeding the call for a million-man occupation.
It was dangerous covering the Egypt story as a journalist, and I think it was even more dangerous covering it as a foreign journalist. I remember when we were there back in February, we kept a very low profile. We tried not to go too much into the crowd in Tahrir Square. We took off all kinds of signage that we had on us that said we were journalists. I mean, of course, you can't hide the camera, but by and large, you don't want to draw more attention to you than is necessary. The offices from which we were broadcasting, we took off all the signs that said that we were media, because this was inciting anger and frustration among the people. People often ask me if being a woman is an advantage or a disadvantage to going to dangerous areas as a journalist. Most of the time it is an advantage, because you find that people perhaps share things more with you, and I'm talking here men and women. Because you're a woman, you're less threatening perhaps than a male colleague. But I did feel frightened being a woman in Tahrir Square.
The people here are angry. They believe that they've simply replaced one dictator, Hosni Mubarak, with another.
I can tell you that whenever I walked through Tahrir Square, I walked with a male colleague, whether it was an Egyptian cameraman or a Russian cameraman, and I always felt much safer putting my arm through his. But people would still walk past me, brush up, squeeze a part of my body, and look at me with this kind of leering that leaves you feel very frightened and very vulnerable as a woman. Back in February, when the police were taken off the streets, there was a real sense of complete lawlessness in Cairo. And I remember doing a lot of reports at night.
Last few hours, the ambulances blaring behind me. There's a lot of chaos and a lot of confusion happening here in Tahrir Square.
And certainly at night I had to walk back to the hotel because there was a curfew and there were no cars on the street. And it was almost surreal walking past apartment buildings and seeing people coming in front of the apartment buildings that have formed a kind of night watch group. And you had people in their 80s and their 90s standing there with literally a kitchen knife or a kitchen broom. And with that, they were going to protect their apartments from these gangs that were patrolling the streets of Cairo. They were trying to steal what they could because, as I say, there were no police around.
This is your friend. This is Hosni Mubarak.
There was one incident in particular where I was very frightened. We were standing on the outskirts of Tahrir Square. I was talking to a group of people, and as always happens, you speak to one person and then everybody comes to hear what's happening, and people were really angry. So it's not that they're listening to what's being said. Often they just want to get their voices expressed on the camera. And in a moment, and that's the scary part, is that these things happen in a moment. In a moment, the entire mood changed, and people started yelling and shouting. Not that they just wanted their voices to be heard, but that they actually wanted to hurt us as journalists. And the Egyptian cameraman that I was working with understood immediately what was happening. He started screaming for me to get into the car. I remember the driver, because we had a driver that had been allocated to us, came screeching down the road. I remember being pushed by the crowd, and the journalist, the cameraman, was pushing me into the car. I remember getting into the car. He kind of flung himself in after me, and the crowd was banging on the car as we sped away. I was very frightened, and it was moments like that when you realize that the mood in a place like Tahrir Square, from one second to another, can change dramatically. I don't even know if the word revolution is the right word, but I certainly don't think the revolution in Egypt is over. We've witnessed two phases of perhaps the same revolution or two revolutions. But again, the anger, the frustration, the disappointment, the sense of hopes not being realized is palpable on the streets of Cairo. Everywhere we went, there was a sense that this country is nowhere near where people had hoped and dreamed it would be back in February. And I think this is the general uncertainty that is sweeping the Middle East. There is a sense that things are changing, but another sense of no one not knowing exactly where and how and what ultimately these changes will bring.